The problems around migration have been getting out of control over recent years. Liberal and civic nationalist societies are facing the realities of adopting multiculturalism with fast-changing demographics. Many ancestral populations are increasingly unhappy with the scale of the changes that have been forced upon them in their own country. Migration that in a number of cases has had no democratic mandate, outcomes that were due to decision-making from a small number of politicians that were acting more on behalf of an ideology and an obsession to increase GDP rather than a democratic preference and mandate. The real question that needs to be answered is, how do we fix the migration problem? In a previous video, we highlighted the relevance and suitability of using direct democracy for migration and citizenship decisions. An ancestral population deserves to decide themselves what happens with migration policy. Even if migrants are polite, friendly, and huge contributors to an economy, it doesn't mean migration must be embraced. The ancestral population does not need to invite and accept any migrants into their country. They have no obligation to accept anyone, even if there was an economic benefit for doing so. It is a preference-based decision that should be made by the ancestral population. That decision could also be highly informed by data if the population chooses to take this information into account. But this is the key thing. No population should be forced to make certain migration policy decisions based on any data source or perceived benefit alone. It's a collective preference-based decision. Any individual can vote based on just their preferences if they wanted to. A migration and citizenship-based referendum could provide a solution for recording the preferences of the population. The government would then need to act on those preferences. The problem within many countries today is the adoption and ramifications of civic nationalism and mass immigration. Many migrants have received citizenship, and the ancestral population have had little to no say in whether they wanted to give these migrants citizenship or not in the first place. As a result of this, if you carried out a vote on the topic of migration with all citizens, the migrants that have received citizenship would influence the outcome of that vote. Non-ancestral citizens could prevent the ancestral population from removing migrants that shouldn't have been in the country in the first place. If a democratic vote was used historically, it could have prevented these migrants from even having citizenship in the first place. Civic voting could result in drastically reducing the voting power and self-determination of the ancestral population. Jumping straight into a referendum vote on migration and citizenship could therefore potentially not achieve the outcome that is actually preferred by the ancestral population. A potential solution to this problem is a referendum vote on the topic of nationalism. Only the ancestral population would be able to participate in this decision. The two choices could potentially be either ethnic nationalism or civic nationalism. If the ancestral population wants to reliably retain its own self-determination, they will want to consider the adoption of ethnic nationalism. An implementation of ethnic nationalism could mean the government consists of only representatives that come from the ancestral ethnic groups. Voting rights and citizenship could then also be given only to the ancestral population. The ancestral population could instead decide to continue with civic nationalism, and in that event, any migration and citizenship decisions could be handled by the existing citizens in the country. One of the problems that will need to be solved for this nationalism vote to be executed is determining who has the right to participate in the vote. For each country, this would be different. For the United Kingdom, for instance, the distinct ancestral ethnic groups would be the English, Welsh, Scottish, and Northern Irish. Using civic voting in the UK could be problematic, as due to mass migration and naturalisation, many migrants have been given citizenship. A vote about migration, such as to remove certain groups and communities, isn't likely going to get much support from the non-ancestral communities with citizenship. A civic vote wouldn't be a fair voting approach in the first place for the ancestral population. In many cases, the ancestral populations were never asked about or approved this scale of migration in the first place. No democratic support or mandate to give out citizenships at the scale that it happened. This means the citizenships that were given out were not democratically supported, which brings challenge to whether they are legitimate. So it doesn't make sense for these communities to become eligible voters that join the decisions about removing certain communities or not from the country. It is often not a decision for the non-ancestral communities to be involved in. Even if there was previously democratic support, the ancestral population can't fully predict the outcomes from migration ahead of time. It takes time to experience the results of that decision. The ancestral population has the largest claim to that land and country. They are the ones that founded it and built the nation themselves. It is the ancestral population that should have self-determination to decide what happens in relation to migration. Even if it was the case that they voted to accept some migration in the past, they have the right to change their minds after having the experience of living with those migrants. They are acting and voting based on their preferences and right to self-determination as a distinct group. In any scenario of whether there was previously democratic support or not, the same outcome applies. It is the ancestral population that needs to decide whether the migrants can stay or whether they need to leave. So the first step of solving the migration problem is determining who should decide what happens to migration. Once this is determined, it is that group of people that will then decide whether any communities or groups should be remigrated back to their ancestral homeland. If the ancestral population doesn't care about its own self-determination as a distinct group, it could continue to use civic nationalism and allow for any existing citizen to participate in deciding who governs the society. However, if the ancestral population wants to remove a certain amount of the population, many of which might have already been given citizenship, then an ethnic nationalist solution is likely the most suitable. So, a vote on nationalism would be useful for enabling the ancestral population to decide themselves whether it wants to handle migration and citizenship decisions themselves, as well as other government responsibilities as a distinct group. If they did, then this could likely mean supporting the adoption of ethnic representatives in government, ethnic voting, and ethnic citizenship. An ethnic state will be the most reliable solution for protecting the ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture of the ancestral population. They would have self-determination to govern their own future and live in a society that is governed by their own interests and preferences. An ethnic governance solution does not stop other people from living in their country. A country wouldn't immediately be able to remove non-ancestral people from government or revoke citizenship. Instead, a referendum that results in the adoption of ethnic nationalism would start a process of gradually migrating towards these solutions. Distinct ancestral ethnic groups, or those that built the society in the first place, would have the right to self-determination to govern their own futures. To most reliably achieve self-determination, you need an ethnic state where this population group can vote for representatives that can act on behalf of their interests. Civic nationalism doesn't reliably lead to that outcome. A non-ancestral community could vote against the interests of the ancestral population. Their voting power could increase over time due to changing demographics. So the self-determination of the ancestral population can become increasingly compromised, eventually leading to less influence and control over their own country, which can make it harder to protect the continuation of their ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture. No other group has the same birthright to live in their society. It is the ancestral population that can use their self-determination to decide who can and cannot live with them. A nationalism vote can provide a clear indication from the ancestral population about how they want the governance of the nation-state to continue. It leads to clarity around whether the ancestral population wants self-determination to govern their own future as a distinct group, or whether they want to continue as a civic nationalist society. Migrants that come from different countries don't need to be involved in the governance of other nations. There is much more to lose in countries that are functional and prosperous. Maintaining a successful and prosperous nation isn't something that is guaranteed over the long term. Any society can trend towards ongoing chaos and decay. Ethnic nationalism adopted at scale should be the most reliable approach to maintain the international diversity of each culture that exists across the world. Each distinct population can continue to exist long into the future. Ethnic nationalism doesn't prevent migrants from living in other countries. Instead, what it does is just ensure that ancestral populations are able to govern themselves so they can decide how their nation changes and evolves over time. Migrants might only be there for economic reasons, or due to their preference to live amongst the ancestral population based on how they operate that society. They wouldn't be there to influence the nation into a direction that they prefer, as it is not their country. Ethnic nationalism can more reliably protect the way of life of the ancestral population. This is why a nationalism vote is a compelling solution to gather and act on the preferences of each distinct population for each nation-state across the world. A nationalism vote could be pretty effective for solving the migration problem. However, when you consider the implementation, the devil is really in the details on this one. To conduct a nationalism vote, there would be a need for some form of sign-up process where the ancestral population can be verified to vote. This would likely mean taking the stance that you're not eligible to vote until you're verified. Existing medical records and other sources of data could be potentially sufficient to determine whether certain people are eligible to vote. A number of people could also be asked to complete a blood or saliva test to better verify their bloodline and ancestry. The problem with blood or saliva-based testing is they are estimations. They are generally very accurate based on the continent your ancestors came from, but they can be less accurate when you try to break it down into specific countries. It also commonly becomes less accurate when you have a very mixed ancestry. So, with today's technology and data sets, this might be a difficult path to reliably verify everyone. And of course, there's a cost involved in conducting that many tests at scale. Although this is a problem at the moment, we should expect to see slow improvements of the accuracy of these tests over time, such as due to the adoption of better reference panels, using more data from the genome, and because of better models and processes. Another way you could make the genetic testing approach work with today's technology is by adopting a continents-based approach. If you already have citizenship and you have a majority ancestry from that particular continent, then that could be a viable criteria for being eligible to vote. The benefit of this approach is it would capture everyone who is in the ancestral ethnic group. But the obvious problem is it would also include people from other countries across the same continent. That might not be too problematic, as the neighbouring countries might have a fairly similar ancestry and genetics, so that part of the problem could be less of a concern. In relation to culture and heritage, surrounding countries could also be somewhat similar. If that's the case, the differences in heritage and culture might also not be a big problem. This approach could be a reasonable compromise and make it easier to verify whether someone is eligible or not to vote. Adopting this approach also doesn't mean that in the future you can't do tests again when they become more accurate. If medical records and other forms of data are accurate enough, you may be able to avoid the need for blood tests to determine voting eligibility. In the event that isn't the case, a broad continent-based blood test could be sufficient to achieve most of what is intended. Even a broad test on people's ancestral background can help to improve the overall clarity on the identities that are vastly different than the ones in the country. Some ancestral populations may be content with this solution, something that's good enough for improving their self-determination as a distinct ethnic group. Once those tests or records provide evidence of eligibility, the voters could then be issued a digital credential that they can use to vote. Self-sovereign identity solutions could be the ideal tool for making a digital voting solution to handle something like a nationalism vote. A nationalism vote should help to solve a fair amount or all of the illegitimacy problem of civic voting due to citizenships that have been given out to people without a democratic mandate or support. If the ethnic nationalism approach is selected, the nation-state can immediately start to identify politicians and public positions in government that do not share the same ancestry as the ancestral population. These individuals could then be replaced in government either through elections or a job hiring process for the relevant government jobs. Within the first year after the referendum, the result should be a more ancestrally operated government. The next part of implementing this change would be to stop any other ethnic group from receiving citizenships with voting rights. This is then coupled with the gradual and ongoing process of revoking citizenships from people who are not part of the ancestral population. This would require collaboration with the ancestral homelands of these populations, so that they would receive citizenship from those countries. So these are just some initial thoughts on how you could approach solving the issue of migration for the long term. An objective for nationalism is to protect distinct identities and distinct societies across the world. Achieving that means ensuring the ancestral populations from these countries have self-determination to govern their own future. To change from civic nationalism over to ethnic nationalism seems fairly unlikely to happen using civic voting. A referendum vote could be necessary, a vote which would be targeted as closely to the ancestral population as possible. Countries that do not have reliable medical records, of which there will be numerous, might need to compromise on this and base the eligibility for voting based on the continent they're from rather than the specific country. After conducting this vote, the government would then be democratically forced to make any change that is necessary to reflect the referendum outcome. After any necessary change is achieved, the eligible population could then vote directly on how they want to handle migration policy moving forward. An important point to consider on the topic of migration and remigration is that the ancestral population doesn't need to justify why they want people to leave their society. These are, of course, valid reasons to endorse remigration or certain policy decisions. However, this isn't actually required. Instead, the right to self-determination is sufficient by itself as the justification for why any distinct group has the right to govern their own future. And this determination gives them the right to ask other groups that are not from their society to leave if that is their preference. This is not the end of the road for this topic or a final suggestion of a solution. A referendum for nationalism could be a good solution, but for now I'm going to go and talk with a number of people who are already working in this area to compare ideas and what other solutions might be effective. I'll provide some updates in the future as other ideas and logic emerge, or just when my own thoughts evolve. Until then, I'll see you all in a future video.